Coming up on Point Spread Weekly, powered by the Vegas Stats and Information Network. We want to make you a better handicapper, and we've got plenty of sports wagering information. Join VSiN's betting experts and odds makers as they discuss sides, totals, money lines, props, and parlays, so you take sharper action. Cashing tickets is what it's all about. It's Point Spread Weekly, powered by VSiN, and it starts right now.
Welcome in. I'm Jonathan Von Tobel, your host here on Point Spread Weekly. Yes, another week has passed. Can you believe it? I can't either. Time's flying by. I'm getting older by the second. But Point Spread Weekly gets better by the second. So make sure you check it out up at vsin.com/subscribes. And I will remind you every single time that you see this face that is soft and mushy that VSiN Plus subs are free until a major sport returns. So you make sure you want to check this out and take advantage, because even a pandemic has not slowed down the content that is churned out for Point Spread Weekly on a week-to-week basis here at the Vegas Stats and Information Network. And it is a great edition, I should say. It's a great episode of Point Spread Weekly, but it's also a great edition that you can check out from talking, Matt Youmans, who we'll have later in the show, talking about the NHL's plan to come back and tying in sports betting and how sports books are going to handle it, to Tooley's weekly takes on horse racing as we just get that much closer on the run for the roses we've talked about with Ron Flatter multiple times, a look at the AFC East as well in this week's Point Spread Weekly, along with a few more things like Steve Makinen's NFL power ratings that you can use to then craft your own power ratings. And you know what? Maybe, because we talked about this throughout the week on The Edge here on the Vegas Stats and Information Network, next week I'll submit our market power ratings that we talked about with Jeff Fogel, compare them with Steve Makinen's power ratings. You can make your own power ratings as well, and that's what Point Spread Weekly is all about. It's using this information to then make you a better handicapper. You can use these tools, craft whatever you will from it, and then go from there. So it doesn't have all the answers, but it has all of the conversations and topics that you need to improve from here on out. And that's not where Point Spread Weekly ends either. As usual, as the NASCAR season has resumed and rolls on, Steve Makinen has his Quick Trip 500 simulation for the weekend. KBO Team Report, as Korean baseball, of course, has gained popularity and becoming more and more popular throughout the weeks as we get closer. Josh Applebaum. I'll tell you, Josh Applebaum does a great job. Of course, you can find the Everything Guide to Sports Betting up at vsin.com as well. Josh Applebaum has his usual piece this week. Betting to risk can beat betting to win. A lot about bankroll management, how you can handle it from this point forward. And of course, as we have a lot of fun here at the Vegas Stats and Information Network, we have fun within Point Spread Weekly as well. I thought this was actually really fun, really intriguing, because there is a piece at the back end of Point Spread Weekly penned by one Brady Cannon. Headline: A Visit to Oasis is Coming Up Aces if you don't listen enough and watch enough of the Vegas Stats and Information Network. Oasis, a very small watering hole out here in Las Vegas that a lot of the guys here like to frequent. Triv looked up. Yes, Triv's been to Oasis. I've been to Oasis many times. John, the bartender, a fantastic bartender over at Oasis, if you're nice to him. I know I've heard many stories of John kicking dudes out by the scruff of their neck. But Oasis, and it is a fun piece to talk about. Of course, conversations in there with guys like Tony Miller over at the Golden Nugget. A lot of friendships made there, according to Tony Miller of the Golden Nugget. But it is a big week in the world of sports and in sports betting, and we'll have more on this in next week's edition of Point Spread Weekly. Why am I telling you this? Because I know that I'm working on something to submit for Point Spread Weekly for next week, as the NBA postseason, of course, has announced its return as well. So we'll have details from Matt Youmans on the NHL, but of course the NBA with the 22-team format, the fact that there is potential for a play-in game if one of these teams in their respective conferences are within 4 games of the 8th seed, a double elimination for the top seed, and a single elimination for the bottom seed, and 8 games of regular season play. But we'll talk about that in next week's edition of Point Spread Weekly, because there's a lot of questions to be answered for that format of the NBA, and I think a big one for these last 8 games, of course, is going to be motivation. We know the motivation for the teams that are trying to fight their way in, but what's the motivation for top teams like the Los Angeles Lakers, who have a 6.5 game lead in their conference, a 5.5 game lead in their conference, or the Milwaukee Bucks, who have a 6.5 game lead in their conference for the top seed, and only 8 games to play, so you're relatively comfortable there. And how are these games going to be scheduled? Because that has not officially been announced yet, and that's going to be massive as you look at those 8 regular season games in terms of betting them, who's going to play one another, and you know that there's going to be other props available, like who will take the seed or the 8th seed in the Western Conference, and that's going to be very important because a team like Phoenix, if the schedules are indeed what we think they're going to be, will not play a single team that is directly ahead of them in the standings, and thus the mountain that they have to climb becomes that much higher if they want to make a run and leap 4 teams that are ahead of them in the standings for the 8th and final seed in the Western Conference. So remember, it is Point Spread Weekly. It is free until a major sport returns, so check it out at vsin.com/subscribe. It is Point Spread Weekly here, though, on VSIN, your weekly episode on the Vegas Stats and Information Network, the sports betting network. Let's welcome in Steve Makinen. Steve, I was waxing poetic as I usually do. Another week and another week of just, I think, great writing in Point Spread Weekly and a lot of tools that a lot of these bettors can use to then become a better handicapper. I continue to be impressed every single week with what you guys have done. And, I submit every once in a while. I'm going to get right back in it with the NBA. But this week was, I think, one of the best ones, and it gets better every week.
Yeah, Jonathan, thanks for having me on. And I can tell you do a fantastic job of introducing the issue. I try to do some of this when I do my index letter every week. But, man, you really wrapped it up there pretty good. Just another fantastic issue. I'd like to talk to you more about that Oasis thing. I read that through and I thought, man, in this time, wanting to get back in a social setting again, so everybody's out at the D bar again, or at the long bar at the D. A lot of great things happening in Vegas. Great to see you in the studio, and great to be with you.
Yeah, I think that's the cool part is, like you mentioned it, like coming out here, right? And I've been in studio for, I think, like this is my second week now, like consistently being in studio. And when I filled in for Gil on a numbers game, I was in studio for that week too. But this week, Steve, like having people actually in the casino, like in the days leading up to the actual opening, cleaning chips and, with the fog machine and just getting ready. And then now the last 2 days, walking in and actually going through the front door and seeing valet taking cars and seeing people at the tables and the machines. Like it's just, there's a different palpable energy going on right now.
I have to believe that I'm sitting here in Wisconsin. I'm seeing everything happening on Twitter, and I'm excited about it. I love seeing the hot dog stand open. Right. At some point, I would love to get a hot dog. Just a lot of things, just exciting to see it. So anxious for some return to normalcy with sports here, and good things happening, that's for sure. We're going the right direction.
When you come out next time, you'll have to go down to Oasis. It's actually, I'm not like, I'm more of like a Fremont Street type guy. I like a lot of people going down there and being amongst the masses. But if there is a nice, as I called it, a watering hole to check out, intimate, cool, bartending service is great. Oasis is a lot of fun. And of course, a lot of the guys at VSIN really like to hang out there. So let's get into some of the pieces that you wrote for Point Spread Weekly this week. First up, I kind of actually wanted to start with your power ratings because, so obviously I've noticed that they're in there each week for the National Football League. Do you just include them week to week, or do you change them each week?
No. They've stayed the same here. The reason being is obviously with the NFL schedule out, the ability to bet games now for each week. There should be ratings in there so people have a reference of where to go. They haven't moved. I haven't moved anything yet. I probably won't do anything with that until training camps and we see if anything develops as far as team personnel, that type of thing. But just a good reference point if anybody's actually attacking. I've been trying to include a lot of different stuff about the NFL, a lot of different ways to look at games throughout the NFL season. So that's just one of them.
So, and the reason I bring this up, so we did a little power rating stuff this week on The Edge, and what we did was we did the market power ratings. And so, you look at how the week one lines are bet, you establish market power ratings, how the market feels about certain teams, and then what I've been doing, in my spare time, and we did it with Jacksonville, we did it with Washington, was crafting expected win totals out of a lot of these. And so when you have power ratings like yours, you can do the same thing, go week to week and establish some of these expected win totals. But I think like power ratings, people will generally look at power ratings and think, okay, cool, this team is, X amount of points better than that. I'll use that for a discrepancy. But in the offseason, power ratings have their use as well, and it can really help you tackle a lot of these win totals if you have your own set of power ratings.
Yeah, what's interesting there about what you just said is I do what I call my bettors ratings throughout the season, and they are pretty much, if you want to call it, a market rating. Now, they are how markets close on a team. Mm-hmm. So, as you look at a team right now in your market ratings, that's how the market is viewing the team at this point. So what I like to do is go week to week on that, and I present those every week in the Point Spread Weekly. They're called the bettors ratings, and I compare them for teams to project how a game may play out on the line and the total.
Okay, so walk us through that really quickly. So for people who are watching, right, so Steve's power ratings, we'll take Kansas City for an example. Power rating for Steve in his NFL power ratings, 31. The better rating, as you have it, is minus 5.4. So walk us through like what the minus 5.4 is as opposed to the 31 for the power rating.
So the minus 5.4 is how the betting closing market would view that team above the average NFL team.
Okay.
So when we last left off the season, the betting market was viewing Kansas City as 5.4 better than the average NFL team, which you're looking at average NFL team probably being last year maybe like the Chargers, somebody like that.
I like it. So then if we're using this as a whole, and this is why power ratings are really important, so your ratings, you have Kansas City as the highest power-rated team in the National Football League, but the bettors have the Ravens as the highest-rated team, and actually ahead of Kansas City even more would be New Orleans, according to your bettors' ratings. Of course, Baltimore 7.1 better than the average team on the spread, 6.1 for New Orleans. Reading that right?
Yeah, so and the way this works is I go back about 3 to 4 weeks most of the time to take these ratings and how they're being perceived. So they can move greatly in a week. If they suddenly close at a price way higher than you would have expected them to be, they will move up quickly. But for the most part, it took a long time for people to really back Kansas City last year. Yeah. Particularly once Baltimore was out of the playoffs, that's when they really got that following.
Right, and even you go back, we're talking just like futures board wise. I think going into the wild card round, they were like 12-1 in that range. Like even after in getting that top seed in the bye, they were still in the range of like 9-10-1 at some shops. So like to your point about not really respecting them until the top team fell, Kansas City did fly under the radar for the most part.
Yeah, absolutely, and even lasted all the way through the Super Bowl game. I mean, the wagering action was not that favorable towards Kansas City. So despite the fact that they were scoring so many points, defensively, they had been really, really good in the second half of the season. It just took a long time for bettors to adapt to that team. And
last one on your power ratings, just so people can actually use them when they go to VSiN.com, subscribe, and they can start to use your power ratings. Simple enough as when you're looking at the power rating to factor in what a spread would be to teams, Cincinnati, Jacksonville, you have 18.5 for Cincinnati, 17.5 for Jacksonville. On a neutral, Cincinnati would be 1 point better than Jacksonville, correct?
Correct. So and then there's also the third rating there. So there's the important thing to note, there's 3 separate ratings. The other one is the effective strength rating. That is purely statistical, 100% statistical rating. So take the difference between the two teams, add whatever home field advantage that you may deem appropriate for that game, and then you'll have an effective point spread.
There you go. All right. So then, again, so you can go through, you can see this. The point of this conversation, if you're watching, is to teach you how you use Steve Makinen's power rating. So you can go through there, and then once you get comfortable, then you can start to craft your own, and you can do it the way that Steve and many other bettors do it. All right. So let's take a look at a couple of things that you have in here. You said we included a lot of National Football League stuff. You did. Head-to-head trends that can aid NFL bettors. Before we get to specific trends, what's your philosophy on trends? Because I know a lot of people, especially some bettors, will see a trend, see that it hits at 64%, and say, I'm in on that side, let's go.
Okay, so I actually mentioned this a little bit in the article this week. There are some trends that I will deem foofy, if you want a better word, just not really worth the foundation of a wager. Now, what I did with these particular head-to-head series trends is I went back and tried to look through the schedule as to head-to-head series trends that I would deem maybe important to that series, maybe a foundational reason as to why you would look at that trend and think it's important and how it may affect this year's game. So clearly there's trends that don't matter. Personally, I try to I think of myself more of a system bettor where I'm fitting not specific teams, but teams that fit into a specific category and how those types of teams have fared in recent years. So. But these are specific head-to-head trends between two teams for this year's games, and I felt them to be somewhat important for this year's matchup.
My favorite trend that I have ever heard, Steve, it was in baseball, and it was like a Colorado Rockies trend, and it was if the Rockies were a $1.80 favorite the day before and had scored more than 2 runs in a single inning, and they were like minus 120 or higher the next day, they were like 18-1. Trends like that. I don't really understand. And people like those kind of trends, but it's just there's so many levels that you have to attain to get to that point of the trend. I don't know if that's really worth it.
Yeah, and the other thing you got to consider is how much teams change within different years. So right. I like to look at trends where the coach is the same. Say you're looking at a trend 3 years back. I want to make sure that a lot of what's going on with that team is still the same. The coaching staff, maybe the key players, and that's the reason the trend has been successful, because they perform better or worse in a certain scenario.
Right, and also you in some of these trends, we'll get to the first one here. A couple of these trends that you have are also divisional matchups, so there's some consistency there as well, where these teams take each other on, twice a year. The teams are relatively consistent as well, so that also helps. So walk us through Week 1, Cleveland at Baltimore, and the trend here.
Yeah, so the trend is these are all very simple trends. Mm-hmm. Road teams are 16-5 ATS in the Cleveland-Baltimore head-to-head series. Now, there's a lot of times where home field advantage will mean more than in other situations. But for me, home field advantage in divisional games doesn't typically tend to be as much because of that familiarity aspect. The teams know each other better. They're used to playing in that scenario. You're used to playing in front of that environment. So this is one of those particular head-to-head series where road teams do fairly well. And in this particular case, Cleveland's getting a pretty good number there against Baltimore.
So I'm curious. We'll get to one of the ones that stuck out to me, and I've always wondered this because if you've ever been a subscriber to Points Per Weekly, which you should, during football seasons, for example, we have our game capsules, and in every single one of those, there's a lot of trends for matchups. And I've always wanted to ask you this because for Week 4, for example, you have Seattle at Miami. So that's obviously NFC versus AFC. They don't play very frequently. So when you have a trend when it's these two matchups like that, where they don't play each other as often, what is the validity of a trend like that where it's AFC versus NFC? They'll meet once every 4 years.
Okay, so this one I happened to pick out because I was looking at the schedule for Seattle before and after this particular game, and this looks to me like it could be a landmine game. And not only the fact that in the two games that Seattle's played Miami with Pete Carroll, they've kind of struggled, but Seattle will be coming off games against New England and Dallas.
Wow.
And then the next week, they'll be playing Minnesota. So those are three teams that you figure playoff-type teams, playoff-type atmospheres. They got this game, this landmine sitting at Miami in Week 4. And it could be a difficult scenario for them. They got to travel pretty far, maybe an overlook atmosphere for them. So a lot of things to look at there, in addition to the fact that they haven't played Miami well recently.
Let's take a look. And again, we're going over this piece, head-to-head trends that can aid NFL bettors, trends for specific matchups week to week in the National Football League that Steve has selected. And there's one for every single week of the National Football League season. So we won't have time enough to go through all of them, but that's why you go and you get Point Spread Weekly, which is free until a major sport returns. I'm going to say that until my head pops off. All right, Week 5, Carolina and Atlanta, another divisional series. So again, another trend that holds a little bit more weight, right, because they play each other twice a year. What's the trend here for Week 5?
So the interesting thing about this trend, Atlanta's 10-2 against the spread in its last 12 hosting Carolina. Now, the fact that it's 12 games is interesting because these have been all in the career of Matt Ryan. So they do well offensively at home against Carolina. They struggle on the road offensively. So I don't think that's coincidence. Now, so in the 10 spread wins in here, Atlanta has averaged 32.6 points per game against Carolina when they're hosting them. That's all in there, Matt Ryan. They got a pretty good offense, again, expected for this year. Carolina, a lot of question marks there, Matt Rule's first season. So I thought, as I looked at that trend, this could be very appropriate for this year's matchup.
The other that really stuck out to me that I'm really interested in, because we have a major change on one side, that would be Week 8, New England at Buffalo. So the trend, New England 15-1 straight up, 13-3 against the spread at Buffalo since 2004. Steve, there's something different about New England, though, this year that I can't quite put my finger on.
Yeah. I think this has probably been put to death here by now as far as how much this is going to change. However, one of the interesting things about this is New England is 15-1 in their last 16 games at Buffalo, 13-3 against the spread. Now, the big question mark for this year, of course, there's some optimism with Buffalo. There's a lot of people down on New England. Is it turned enough to think where that type of trend can be overcome here by Buffalo this year. It's obviously going to be a huge game in terms of if this torch has been passed in the AFC East.
Yeah.
15-1, that's a lot to overcome, especially that they've been an underdog in 14 of those games, and in 2 that they were favored, they lost both of those. So if it does happen to be a spot right now, the odds say Buffalo by 1.5. I'm not banking on that yet.
Yeah. All right, before we get you out of here, Steve, walk us through it again. You've explained the process, but for people who are just joining us, we have the race simulation, Folds of Honor Quick Trip 500, that is in Point Spread Weekly, but walks us through the process here because, if I remember correctly, right, you have this race simulation, but then it changes later in the week. Okay,
so I just happened to run my the lineup for Sunday's race was announced last night. I reran this week's final simulation this morning. I submitted at ability, so that will be coming out in the newsletter. I'm not sure which day, but that will be available to subscribers. The simulation takes into a lot of factors. How a guy does at a certain track, how they do it at similar tracks, how they're doing recently, where their starting spot, and normally when we're at a normal schedule, how they do in practice as well. So last week, I don't know if anybody happened to be following really close at Bristol, I had the top 3 pegged with 2 laps left.
Wow.
It would have been an exacta or trifecta if the top 3, but the top 3 were pegged, and Chase Elliott took out Joey Logano, and Brad Keselowski, who I had at number 2, ended up slipping into the number 1 spot and winning. But I was on the edge of my seat. I had so many bets going for the race. And although it was disappointing, I did have Brad Keselowski because I always take my top 2 winners. But I really like when my simulation pegs the winner, and I had Logano. He was in a perfect spot, and just kind of disappointing. But just to summarize, Chase Elliott's first after the final simulation. You can get the rest of the projection in the newsletter one of the next couple days.
Steve, we're up against it. Always good to talk to you. We'll chat next week, okay?
All right, Jonathan. Thanks for having me.
Yep, every time. All right, check out the work in Point Spread Weekly. It's free until the major sport returns. The Big F, Ron Flatter, on the other side. Welcome back into Point Spread Weekly. I'm Jonathan Von Tobel. You know what time it is here on PSW. Time to check in with the Big F, Ron Flatter, in our Run for the Roses, as we've called it here on Point Spread Weekly. Are you in studio? I'm here by myself.
Yeah. Look to your left. No, that's the illusion of being there.
I love it.
How goes it, JVT?
It's going well. So let's start with, before we get into your article. Tell us what's going on with the Ron Flatter Racing Pod, because we do have a new edition up, correct?
Yeah, we do. And the preview of weekend racing, particularly what's going on at Santa Anita. The Santa Anita Derby is a win and you're in for the Kentucky Derby. And it features a rematch of Authentic and Honor AP. 2 horses when they last raced 3 months ago, by the way. Authentic for Bob Baffert was a handy winner over Honor AP, and it basically went 1-2 as you would figure the race would have gone with those 2. Well, Honor AP, we found out later, didn't have a fully healthy foot, at least one of the 4. And so he's fully healthy now. Can that make the difference? Plus the slightly longer distance of this race, will that make the difference at 1 1/8 to determine who wins this one? It could play to Honor AP because of his being a little healthier and the race being a little bit longer because he's going to be making up distance. He was making up ground late in the race. Now you got a little more race. So that's what the feature is. We've got Millie Ball Yakteen talking about that from XBTV, John Sheriffs, who trains Honor AP, and Chris Andrews, who will be handicapping races on the card, including the Santa Anita Derby. So that's what you find on the Ron Flatter Racing Pod, sponsored by First Bet.
I like it. And by the way, so that rematch that you're talking about here, that's going to have an effect on the futures, right, in terms of the set futures for the winner of the Kentucky Derby at Circa and William Hill and others?
Oh, no doubt about it, because you're talking about 2 of maybe the top 10 betting choices right now in the Kentucky Derby futures between Circa and William Hill. Well, the winner of the race, if it's one of those 2, is odds are going to shorten. And especially in the case of Authentic, since he's from the Baffert barn, remember, Nadal was forced into retirement by that injury from last week. So he may become the star of the Baffert barn while we wait to see what Charlatan has happen with him getting ready for the Belmont Stakes in 2 weeks. And if Honor AP wins, well, that'll flip the whole thing on its ear. And then we could have a whole different order as he could become, the new flavor of the week, as we often have in Kentucky Derby futures betting.
Yeah, unfortunate for Nadal, not the tennis player, as it took storm. When that was announced, everybody thought Nadal, the tennis player, had retired.
Yeah.
In fact, the horse due to an unfortunate injury. All right, so we do it every time with you, Ron. Walk us through the first 3 horses who are hot in the Kentucky Derby futures market.
It's interesting. King Guillermo, we've heard that he may not race again until the Kentucky Derby, although there is some thought that maybe he'll go sooner than that. He was the upset winner of the Tampa Bay Derby back during the late winter. So he's gone to 13-1 at Circa, 25-1 at William Hill, but it looks like there's a little action on him at Circa. Sole Volante hasn't raced in 3 months. He was the beaten favorite in that Tampa Bay Derby, but as the races go longer, his deep closing style is getting a little bit more attention to the positive. And Dr. Post for the Todd Pletcher stable, he was a $400,000 yearling when he was sold, and he's going to be in the Belmont Stakes. There was a real push to get him in there, so also a real push to maybe get betting on him for the Kentucky Derby coming up later in the year. As for who's not, Dennis's Moment, man, how the mighty have fallen. He's now completely unlisted in terms of domestic futures because he finished last in his last 2 races, and Dale Romans took him off of the Derby trail. Porthos, a 5th place finish last Thursday in a Churchill Downs allowance race, led Circa to lengthen him to 200-1. He's completely off the board at William Hill. And Digital once was as short as 100-1, drifted to 250, then to 300-1 at Circa, and was one of 14 horses dropped this past week by William Hill, despite a narrow second-place finish at 9-1 odds in a Memorial Day sprint allowance at Churchill Downs. I'm not so sold on throwing him completely out, but don't expect to see any of my money on him. Others who might want to bet on him, yeah, there might be a shot. You take a look at him at 300-1. You have to ask yourself when you see a price like that at this point before the Derby whether it's really worth it.
So before we get you out of here, just for me, as again, like a novice horse racing bettor and somebody who's trying to keep track a little bit more of what's been going on, since it's been pretty interesting now that this has been expanded out. You mentioned in your piece, so Santa Anita, the card's pretty big. What else should I be watching for this weekend at Santa Anita?
Oh, you've also got the Santa Anita Oaks. It's a small field, but you've got a horse in there that is actually shipping in from the Midwest. And as a result of that move, you're looking at a horse that's already the favorite for the Kentucky Oaks in futures betting offshore. And so with that in mind, you look there and see the result of that race as well. And also the Hollywood Gold Cup, and that's a very handy race for older horses. So keep an eye on that, just because the older division, of course, we'll be talking about that for the Breeders' Cup down the line.
Ron, always good to catch up with you, my friend. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks, JVT.
See you later, man. All right, Ron Flatter, the Big F, as we call him. Follow him on Twitter at Ron Flatter. We'll be back. A little fight talk with Lou Finocchiaro. Matt Youmans, the Beast, will join us as well. Quick Picks, real money parlay props game based on daily fantasy scoring. VSiN customers can play Quick Picks through this special offer, getting 100% automatic deposit bonus up $100 when you sign up for a new Quick Picks account. Sign up now, quickpicks.com/VSiN bonus, then select who you think will finish with higher fantasy point totals. Go to quickpicks.com/VSiN bonus. Start playing Quick Picks now. It is Point Spread Weekly here on VSiN, the Sports Betting Network, and we have had a glut of Ultimate Fighting Championship cards. I will never argue with more mixed martial arts, and who better to break it all down than Lou Finocchiaro, as he always has his piece for these cards inside the octagon. Lou, thank you very much for joining us. So, despite the fact that in the main event, Amanda Nunes is in the range of a $6, $6.50 favorite, I'm actually really intrigued by this fight. And it's mainly because watching Felicia Spencer fight, her game plan seems to be, I'm going to absorb punishment just as much as so I can get you up against the fence and start to work my clinch and do what I want. She's not really a great defensive fighter, and I'm fascinated by this because, like the Cyborg fight, right, with Felicia, she took a lot of punishment, but Cyborg's gas tank started to deflate. The strikes weren't as much, so she was able to go 3 rounds. Can you do that for 5 rounds against Amanda Nunes is the question.
That is the question, Jonathan. And again, thank you for having me visit with you guys. The key is what kind of fire is Felicia Spencer going to undertake in order to try and get close to Nunes? Spencer, the Nunes camp, and all of us fans realize that this cannot be a stand-up fight for Felicia Spencer. She has to get in there tight, put her forehead on Amanda's collarbone, and then try and get to top position. Amanda Nunes cannot be discounted on the ground, especially if she gets top position. If Felicia Spencer, who's a natural 145-pound fighter who will weigh 158, 160 when she gets in the octagon, if she can find a way to tire Nunes out and then earn top position on the floor, that's her prescribed method to victory. Can she execute it, and what kind of battering will she take trying to get inside into Nunes is what remains to be seen.
So when you look at Felicia and the route to a victory, you kind of mentioned, what the blueprint would be. And again, you wrote in Point Spread Weekly, you've passed on this card. But if the blueprint to victory for her, if you're going to play her, I would assume it would be submission or decision. You're going to get 10-1, 15-1 on those, as opposed to getting in the range of like a plus 400, something like that on Felicia Spencer. I would think it'd be more accurate, or it'd be better for you to invest your money, if you're going to, on one of those 2 options as opposed to just win outright, correct?
Sure, right. But Jonathan, I tend to be really conservative when I bet.
Right.
And so to me, a bet for Felicia Spencer is a bet on the over. But when I look at that price of minus 185, then I want to get into the props. Would the fight start round 3? Would the fight start round 4? Maybe try and get closer to plus 100 or even dog money. I do believe that Spencer will be the toughest test for Nunes to date, because again, Nunes is really a good 35er, and she's a strong 45er. Spencer's a natural 45er. And so that's why I tend to think the fact that Spencer's tough and she's a big woman, that maybe this thing gets pushed into the 3rd or 4th round.
Yeah, I think that it'll be interesting to see if her style goes back to bite her too, because I was even watching the Zara Farron fight with her earlier today, and Farron's kind of like a really stiff striker, but even she was eating shots against Farron, and Farron's not the most elusive striker in the world. Eventually she got her down and ultimately finished her, but Spencer takes a lot of damage when it comes to some of their fights, just so she can set up what she wants to do. All right, let's take a look at another fight on the card, and you mentioned this in your write-up, and I would agree with you. I was actually kind of surprised to see that the Garbrandt-Assunção fight was the co-main event, where there's a couple more bantamweight fights on the card that are a little bit better, and you mentioned it with the Aljamain Sterling Corey Sandhagen fight. So walk us through this one. And Sandhagen too, he actually did fight Assunção. It was a very technical fight, went the distance. He went on the ground though. He can stand up and strike. He seems to be a well-balanced guy. What's the breakdown with him and Sterling?
Yeah, I totally agree with you. This could be the most competitive fight of the card, and one that I really look forward to. 2 really skilled guys. Sandhagen, 5'11", has unusual height for this division, 135 pounds, and therefore he's used to being the taller, longer, rangier guy. However, in this fight, Sterling has 1 inch of reach. Having a height advantage without having a reach advantage is no advantage. And while Sandhagen is the more fluid mover, and while Sandhagen definitely needs space and room in order to execute his striking plan, he is relatively one-dimensional. He only has 26% takedown defense, even though Sandhagen comes from a really excellent on-fire gym in Team Elevation. I believe the more well-rounded fighter, in fact, the fighter with the wrestling base, is Sterling. And Sandhagen's last 3 fights was against a debuting fighter, 5'3" John Lineker, a one-dimensional slugger, and then 5'5" Rafael Assunção. Sterling's 5'7", is going to use the smaller cage to try and crowd Sandhagen and eventually get him to the mat. And I think that the body of work that Sterling has faced is greater than the body of work Sandhagen has faced with only 5 UFC fights. And for that reason, I do lean Sterling. I don't lean Sterling in this fight. I've released him, and I have wagered on Sterling in this fight.
Lou Finocchiaro. All right, Lou, we got a couple minutes left. I'd love to get your thoughts. I mentioned it. It's probably not as good as this fight, but I am really intrigued to see if Cody Garbrandt can bounce back. 3 consecutive losses, 2 of them to TJ Dillashaw. Finished in all 3. Finished in the first round in 2 of them. So what's the breakdown here for him and Assunção? Because Assunção's, he's got some hands on him, but he doesn't want to stand up and bang like Cody wants to do.
37-and-a-half-year-old Rafael Assunção, his best days are behind him. Yeah. He's now just a workman-like athlete at 5'5". He'll be giving away height and reach to Garbrandt and tremendous quickness and quick twitch. Garbrandt has to navigate a very weak beak, and Assunção with that small frame isn't necessarily the one that's going to catch him, although Munoz did. Mm-hmm. I'd be worried if I was on the Garbrandt train, especially as a favorite, but with a gun to my head, I think he's too much, too athletic, too fast. I like his move to John Henry's camp and Ricardo Almeida over in New York, and I think Garbrandt shows well on Saturday night.
All right, Lou. Hey, we're up against it. It's always good to talk to you and always good to read your work that you wrote in Point Spread Weekly. We will catch up soon, okay?
Thanks, Jonathan. Good luck, everybody.
Lou Finocchiaro, again, Gamblu. You can find the work up in Point Spread Weekly, write-ups on the 2 fights there on Insight the Octagon, and, of course, great insight for mixed martial arts. And you can hear them on multiple shows on the Vegas Stats and Information Network, including Follow the Money. UFC 250 is going to be great. UFC cards in general are fantastic, and if you watch the network, you know that I'm a fan of mixed martial arts. So the UFC 250, I don't think, will be any different than any of the cards that we watch. All right, Matt Youmans joins us next as we wrap it up here on Point Spread Weekly. Last few minutes here on Point Spread Weekly. Always a reminder, check out Point Spread Weekly up on vsin.com. You can sign up at vsin.com/subscribe. And again, I will say this until my head explodes. Point Spread Weekly and VSiN Plus subs are free until a major sport returns. So check it out, vsin.com/subscribe. Matt Youmans is with us. So, of course, senior editor for Point Spread Weekly, host on Follow the Money, and multiple other shows here on the Vegas Stats and Information Network. Youmans, before we get into the nitty-gritty of Point Spread Weekly, I am going to take everybody on a journey here to page 26. Headline, a visit to Oasis is upcoming aces. Brady Canning waxing poetic about the local watering hole that you guys love so much.
Yeah, Tony Miller, the Golden Nugget sportsbook director, told me, I don't know, I'd say 3 or 4 years ago, hey, come over and meet me at this bar. It's a pretty cool local spot. And it turned out to be a great sports bar we go to quite often. It also serves Bookmaker Blonde, and I think that's why Bill 80 allowed that Brady Cannon story to be in Point Spread Weekly this week.
There was always a reason. There's always a method behind the madness. I thought, man, this is pretty nice.
There's another reason, too. JVT, I forgot that Michael Gaughan's son, John Gaughan, actually owns the bar. So there are 2 reasons, aside from the fact that a lot of us at VSiN or who are on VSiN hang out at the bar. Yeah.
And the fact that, beside the fact that they have great bacon, and John the bartender might be one of the best bartenders on the planet in terms of keeping your cup filled, right?
Yep, exactly.
All right, let's talk a little bit. So your piece this week, and there's been a lot going on in the world of sports, and since Point Spread Weekly has come out, we have the update in the NBA, which I'll submit a piece on that for next week's edition. But Bettman points the NHL in a better direction now that we have the format for the National Hockey League. I was curious, before we get to some of the details of your piece, when you looked at like the top 4 seeds, did you think that you only get 3 games in terms of these round robins, but I feel like there's I don't feel like there's much motivation for these top 4 seeds to play for a top seed. You know what I mean? Like, it's like, hey, let's get in, let's get our legs under us. But for the most part, what's the point of going onions to the wall for the top seeds? You're not getting home ice.
Onions to the wall.
Right.
I like that. I know you know me as primarily as a hockey and soccer guy, JVT, but I can't talk about other sports. But today we're going to talk about hockey. I'm agreeing with you. You and I talked about this on the Edge a couple days ago, and to win the top seed in a conference, who really cares? I mean, what is the motivation there? Do you get much? You might find, some sort of an edge in a potential matchup, but I think that's all guesswork at this point. I would think that, you look at the top 4 seeds in the East: Boston, Tampa Bay, Washington, Philly. What's the motivation to be the 1 seed, the 2, the 3, the 4? Does it really matter when you're not talking about home ice? You're going to be playing at a neutral location. This is just a TV show, essentially. So I don't think these teams, as you said, will go onions to the wall to try to get the top seed. In the West, it's St. Louis, Vegas, Colorado, Dallas. Do you think Vegas really cares if it's the 1 seed or the 4 seed when you're talking about playing on ice, even if it's in Vegas with no fans? I don't think that's much of an advantage. So I don't think that's a great betting opportunity necessarily when you look at it. The odds are up on the team to win the top seed, and then obviously you have the matchups, the 4 matchups in the qualifying round in the East and the West.
And I think Vegas is actually a really intriguing example, and obviously I know a little bit more about them. They're in our backyard. But the Golden Knights, Youmans, some people might not remember, they had a goaltender competition at the end of the regular season before they reached this hiatus. So did they use that round robin to test out Leonard and Fleury? And by the way, if you hadn't paid attention, Leonard had been the better goaltender in his 3 starts other than Marc-Andre Fleury, who had gone 2-2 in his 4. So, do they use that and they go, you know what, screw it, we're not going to play for a seed. We got 3 games to see which of these guys is going to be better.
That's actually a pretty good point because those aren't high-stakes games. So you can play Fleury in a couple of those games and see if he's still got it. When you said goaltender competition, there was no competition, really. It was Leonard was better than Fleury. It was not even close. So if the Knights are playing a must-win game, it's going to be Leonard in goal instead of Fleury, but you're correct. I think in that, round robin to win the top seed, you can play Fleury in a couple of those games and see how sharp he is.
So let's talk about this, and you mentioned this in the piece. So once the plan was announced, it wasn't entirely clear, our division winners, actual winners of the divisions, how the NHL was going to handle that and score that. Some books decided to pay those out, and you can talk about William Hill and how they handled it, but also tie in the fact, and you mentioned this in the piece, the NHL, the NBA, they're now partners with operators. You have, I think, an obligation to make certain things clear, especially now when you're in bed with operators, and the NHL didn't exactly do that.
No, that's the case. The NHL has an official gaming partnership deal with MGM Resorts, and if you go to a Golden Knights game at T-Mobile Arena on the Strip, you'll see a lot of William Hill advertisements. Mm-hmm. And I think that, I think the NHL has a responsibility to make statements to clarify betting decisions when the books need those, because that avoids potential controversies. And we're always talking about the integrity of the game, right? The integrity of the game is a buzz phrase that Roger Goodell loves. Well, these leagues now have a responsibility to help the books uphold the integrity of the bets. And NHL didn't really make it clear if these teams were official division winners, if all 24 teams were officially playoff teams, or if the first round was a qualifying round to get into the playoffs. And Nick Bogdanovich, William Hill said, they sent a message out to the NHL and didn't get a response. Really, it wasn't really clear. I talked to Jeff Davis at the Caesar Sportsbook this week, and Jeff said he's going to pay out for all 24 teams on the playoff props. His props did not specify that 82 games must be played for action, whether it's 80, 81, or 82. The NHL fell well short of that. Jeff's going to have to pay out 24 teams to the yes on the playoff props, and he decided to do that when the NHL finally stated it will count stats from these qualifying round games as playoff stats. Mm-hmm. So at that point, Davis said, yeah, I've got to pay out 24 teams to make the playoffs instead of 16. Wow. So, yeah, that's the case. And, everything that's happened, since March with all these cancellations and postponements and just the way the sports world's been turned upside down, JVT, it's going to affect the way the sportsbook operators write the rules to all these props and everything going forward, because you don't want to get caught with your pants down, so to speak. And some of these bookmakers have done that because some scenarios have popped up that we never could have imagined. And that's why you end up paying out 24 playoff teams instead of refunding everything, which the Westgate, by the way, specified the number of games must be played in the regular season. The Westgate refunded all of that stuff.
Yep.
As far as NHL, when you're talking about divisions and point totals and playoff props.
Yep. And by the way, we should note, because I've gotten this question before with the NBA. If you had a futures ticket, Youmans, before the hiatus, as long as a champion is declared, right, then your future ticket, at least for the NHL title, is still live.
That's correct. Yeah. And there's still some NBA bets that are alive. I've got Ja Morant to win Rookie of the Year.
Yep.
You have some individual player props and some stuff in the NBA that's still alive. Unfortunately, I had 2 NBA win total bets were refunded. The Warriors under 48.5, and I think the Celtics over 48. But that's, pretty standard. When you fall far short of 82 games, those win total bets are going to be refunded.
Yep. Well, and I was excited. This was the first year for the Westgate's NBA win totals contest. And so you'll get a refund on your entry fee there. But, that was a really cool concept that, of course, we won't have a winner on. And I'm sure that I was on pace to win. I don't know anything, but I'm sure I was. All right, really quickly, before we get you out of here, when you looked at overall, like when you talked to Brian Blessing, because you talked to him for this piece, did he bring up any angles in terms of layoffs, how certain teams would handle it, any betting angles that now that we know what's going to happen and what the layoff is?
First of all, I'll say it's difficult to bet this stuff at this point because we're, essentially 7 weeks out. I think the starting date's going to be July 29th. There's so many things that we don't know at this point. So Brian did say it's kind of a crapshoot, but he said if he played a couple of series bets, one would be Columbus, which is right now a plus 150 underdog to Toronto. That's the William Hill line, and that's going to be a qualifying round matchup. And Brian likes the Columbus Blue Jackets plus 150. If you remember last year, the Blue Jackets were, big dogs to the Tampa Bay Lightning in the first round and blew out the Lightning. And you always wonder, too, Brian said, how does a long layoff benefit a team possibly like the New York Islanders, who had lost 7 in a row before the season was postponed in March? The Islanders might come back and look like a totally different team after the long layoff. If you get a hot goalie in a situation like this, the team's confidence and momentum can change dramatically. So essentially, Columbus plus 150 was his best series bet. But like Brian said, what if a star player tests positive for the virus during the middle of the series? What if you have a cluster of players? There's so many things that can happen between now and when the playoffs really get into the deep 4 or 5, game 6, whatever. That I think it's difficult to find advantage in a number at this point. If you're looking to bet the NHL or NBA, I think it's just probably you're better off wait and see at this point and probably bet this stuff in late July. Yeah,
I was actually interested too. Like in the NBA, it's pretty stark. But some of these teams, Youmans, that like really thrive at home but struggle on the road, how does playing on a neutral affect them? Like if you get in a routine playing on a neutral because you're going to stay wherever you're at for like a month, does that become a faux home court, or is it still like a road court or a road ice for them?
Mm-hmm.
When they struggle on the road? Because that was another aspect I'm really interested to see if it plays out.
Well, there's no doubt about that. Also, how sharp are these teams going to be? You talked about, are the Lakers going to look as sharp as they did when the season ended in mid-March? How long is it going to take them to get that edge back? And the same is true with these hockey teams as well.
Yep. Lakers 7-1 in their last 8 games before the break with a plus 14 net differential. It was insane what they were doing. All right, man. Hey, it's good to catch up with you as always. You can find Youmans' work in Point Spread Weekly. Follow him on Twitter at Matt Youmans 24/7 and watch Follow the Money. We'll talk next week.
You bet. Thanks, man.
Yep. Matt Youmans, again, senior editor of Point Spread Weekly. And check out all the work again at vsin.com/subscribe. Should also note, of course, that we didn't even scratch the surface of this week's edition of Point Spread Weekly. There's a lot more in there. Will Hill, not the operator, like William Hill himself, one of our writers, has his breakdowns, of course, on these NFL teams, specifically the AFC East. We again have the race simulations, as we brought up with Steve Makinen, and much, much more in the pages of Point Spread Weekly. So it is free until the major sport returns. Make sure you check it out up at vsin.com/subscribe. And Point Spread Weekly, of course, goes live every single Wednesday, 10 a.m. Pacific time is when it finds itself in your inbox. So you'll get it every single week, along with a lot of the other, bells and whistles that you get with the VSiN Plus sub, like access to live replays, cool emails that tell you what some of the hosts like, some of the guests like. Check it out, vsin.com/subscribe. We will see you next week.